talking a little bit about infectious disease, which encompasses a really broad category or several broad categories of different biological agents that can cause disease. Um, before we get or before we dive too deeply into that, why don't we start with a quiz question just to see where you guys are at right now. Good job. It's D. So an infectious disease is something that can be spread from one person to another and a disease that is caused by a pathogen. And so we'll take a look at some of these pathogens now. So common categories of pathogens include viruses, which we'll be talking a lot about today, fungi, bacteria, and parasites. They're collectively known as microorganisms and studied by microbiologists. Each of these different categories, viruses, fungi, bacteria, parasites, they all behave very differently. And because of that, they require very different methods of treatment and diagnosis. So just zooming in and taking a look on each one of these individually. So viruses, such as SARS-CoV-2 that we're talking about today, are small, non-living infectious agents that require a host cell to replicate. That's one of the most defining features of a virus. It's non-living and it requires the host cell to replicate. Examples include SARS-CoV-2, West Nile, HIV, and like your common flu. Contrast that to bacteria, which are slightly bigger. They're living prokaryotes, so they don't have the nucleus and they don't have as many membrane-bound organelles that can replicate on their own. So these do not require a host to replicate. And examples are E. coli, Salmonella. Moving on, you have fungi, which are larger living eukaryotes, so cells similar to the cells in our body, but they can replicate on their own, and things like this include yeast, mold, and mushrooms. And then last categories, you have parasites, which are larger, and these can honestly be a very large range of sizes. They can be microscopic, like amoeba, or they can be really large, like pinworms and tapeworms. They're larger living eukaryotes, which live inside a host organism, and they can replicate both on their own and using a host cell, depending on which type of category they fall into. So taking a look about viruses, because that's what we're interested in today, they're very, very small, on the order of, like 20 to 400 nanometers, infectious agents. It's really important that they cannot produce on their own. They need to infect the host cell, and that's what causes us to become sick, is that they infect our own host cells, the cells of our body, and then they kind of take over the machinery of our cells to start producing viruses. And those cells our own cells will start producing the viruses and then release them out. And they usually contain RNA or DNA as genetic material. So another quick quiz question. What is the name of a scientist or doctor who studies viruses? A fungologist, virologist, bacteriologist, or a parasitologist? Good job, B, a virologist. So virologists are scientists and doctors who study everything about viruses, ranging from structure, class, or classification, evolution, the ways in which they infect their hosts, how they use those host cells, because there's a variety of different ways they can use the host cells and the diseases they can cause, how to isolate them, and hopefully how to treat them. So there's over 200 known viruses that infect humans, many types, and they all cause different symptoms, from respiratory symptoms, gastrointestinal symptoms, all sorts of different types of symptoms depending on which cells they target in your body. Common examples of viruses include norovirus, which usually causes vomiting and diarrhea, varicella zoster virus, which causes your common chickenpox that many of us have had, adenoviruses, which can cause runny nose, cough, sore throat, fever, and body aches, and then West Nile virus, which can cause fever, body aches, diarrhea. But actually, most patients who are infected with West Nile viruses tend to have no symptoms, but those that do usually get the fever, body aches, and diarrhea.
And I think Santa Ana had a West Nile virus outbreak back in 2014. So some of you may remember that there was this in the Santa Ana community, and had to take different public health measures to reduce the spread of West Nile virus?
Yeah, so that kind of brings us into this next slide, transmission, because transmission plays a very key role in how we classify viruses and how we can keep them from spreading. It's really important to understand. And so there's two broad categories of transmission, direct and indirect. Direct transmission includes person-to-person contact, which usually requires physical contact between people. Droplet spread, which I know you guys have heard a lot about recently because SARS-CoV-2 is droplet spread. So virus containing droplets that are projected into the air when you cough or sneeze, or even when you speak, can linger in the air and be breathed in by other individuals and infect them. You have bloodborne, which requires direct contact with blood or bodily fluids. And then you also have indirect. So indirect transmission is classified as airborne, which is similar to droplet spread, but much smaller, and it's kicked up dust or the droplets, they've dried and they're droplet particles that are smaller than 5 micrometers. Those tend to linger in the air much, much longer. So you can get infected that way. There's vehicle transmission, which requires what's like a vehicle, so water or food that gets contaminated and people drink the water and they end up getting sick. Vector, which is what West Nile virus is common, and because you guys have known that, the reason why they're spraying is to get rid of those mosquitoes, because vectors require or are any living organisms that are capable of transferring disease between humans. So in the case of West Nile, you can't it's not likely to get it from human contact. You require that mosquito that's infected to bite one person and bite the other. And then contaminated surfaces such as doorknobs, phones, and etc. And then there's this cool resource put on by Orange County at ocvector.org, and they talk about all the different viruses that are going around or pathogens that are going around, especially West Nile, and the different vectors and the control measures they're using to take care of them in the community.
So it's really important here because prevention of disease really is based on prevention of transmission. And so that's something to really keep in mind here. So depending on what type of virus you're talking about, and really how it's transmitted is really the best way of preventing additional further disease in other people. So hand washing, cleaning surfaces, and not sharing water bottles. For example, in the case of coronavirus, and things like spraying for mosquitoes in the case of West Nile virus.
All right, it's C, vehicle-borne. Good job. Water is acting like a vehicle and is most likely contaminated, and as people drink from the well, they are getting more and more infected. Another quiz question: which of the following are ways that SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, can be transmitted? Select all that apply. So handshake, droplet spread, airborne, from contaminated food and water, mosquitoes, or infected doorknobs. All right, good job. So handshakes, droplet spread, and infected doorknobs, which are all things you've been hearing in the news. Avoid close contact, so avoid handshakes, wear masks to prevent droplet spread, and disinfect commonly used surfaces like such as doorknobs and phones. Because we know the way SARS-CoV-2 spreads, all these measures help